paint I use is Winsor & Newton gouache, except for my black, which is watercolor. I do this because it's a little bit more transparent and it's just a personal preference. You can use gouache for the entire thing if you'd like. I have about 20 paints, but you only really need 8 colors to get most colors that you'd ever want to create. You need a warm and cool red, a warm and cool blue, a warm and cool yellow, and then white and black. I don't think you need anything fancy for your palettes. These are just some cheap ones that I got for a couple of dollars. I tend to store my paints in my palettes all the time. This is partially out of laziness, but also because it's more economical because the paint can be re-wet. You don't have to use fresh paint every time. The colors that you're mostly going to be using, you should have those ones be fresh, but the rest can be old and doesn't really matter. This is one of the advantages of watercolor and gouache, water-based paints, is that they are re-wettable. But be careful because not all paint is re-wettable. For instance, acrylic gouache is not re-wettable. So test to make sure that your paint can be re-wet after it's laid down before you try and do this with your palettes, or else you'll have to get new palettes. I really only use 2 brushes, a medium-sized, slightly tapered brush, and then a smaller detailed brush. I can do pretty much every single shape that I do. Almost all my pieces, I only use these 2 brushes. The final piece is my watercolor paper. I choose to use Arch's watercolor blocks, which are a bunch of pieces of paper all glued together into a cube. This helps prevent the paper from warping while you paint. If you don't choose to use watercolor blocks, you can use other kinds of watercolor paper. There's a whole bunch of kinds out there, but if you use flat sheets, you have to stretch watercolor paper, which means that you have to wet the entire thing and tape it down at the edges to like a watercolor illustration board. If you choose to buy a watercolor block, the first step you have to do when you open it is remove this black piece of paper that's on the top. The way you do this is you use a palette knife or just even a regular knife and stick it in here and then just pull it off. Like that. So there's 3 components to painting with gouache: water, paint, and time. It's all about how much of each of those you have. So you want to make sure that you have a good balance between your paint and your water, and how quickly or slowly you apply the paint is going to affect the overall consistency of the shape and also your ability to paint cleanly in layers. Gouache is intended to be used with the paint consistency of melted ice cream, but that's a lot too thick to paint the way I do. So I water my gouache down so it's more like watercolor. I'll show you how to get a good consistency for nice, even layers. So I like to mix my paint a little bit thicker first and then add water to that, instead of trying to add paint back into water once you already have a too liquidy. So start thicker and go lighter as you go. And you can kind of test on your paper. So you want that kind of consistency. You want to be able to see little tiny speckles of the paper coming through. That's getting too thin. That's too light. That's a bit too thick, but that one is the perfect consistency. And the way you do that is by how much paint and water you have on your brush. So you don't want to have too much water, or else it'll end up like this, and you don't want to have too little or end up like that. And how quickly you apply it will make it more even. So that's the 3rd component, which is time. Like that. So once you lay down a flat color, you don't want to mess with it, because if you do, you get something that's called a hot spot, which is where you try and apply paint to an area where you've already applied paint, but it's not fully dry. You'll get a little bit of lightening. It's hard to see probably, but you'll get a teeny bit of lightening down on these edges. So if you try and mess with the top surface too much, you'll start lifting the paint off. And if you look closely, you can see that this area on the bottom is lighter than the area on the top. That's because the paint that was already there has been lifted by the water on my brush. This will actually create a permanent lighter section. It doesn't matter how many layers of paint you put on afterwards, you can't get rid of it. So it's really best to just paint a color shape and leave it alone and just be patient. And then you'll get a color that you like in the end. Here's a clearer example of this concept. I painted this blue square first, and then went back in and tried to paint on top of it in this corner. But it didn't do anything I wanted, it only lightened the color, which is why I wrote lighter down here. This will happen anytime you try and mess with paint that is not fully dry. So fully let your paint dry before you move on to layering anything on top of it. A big factor that affects drying time is your room's humidity. I personally have these little humidity readers. This is because I am a total nerd and I care a lot about how humid it is in my room because it really affects my paint. This thing tells me that it's 64% in here, which is pretty high. So that means that everything is going to take longer to paint. The reason why is because there's more moisture in the air, which gets into your paper and also gets just into your paint. And so when there's more moisture in the air, the moisture in your paint takes longer to dry. So you just have to be a little bit more patient when it's humid. If it's really, really dry, what I recommend is having a damp paper towel just lightly on top of your painting in between layers. So let each layer fully dry, then lay the damp paper towel down for 2 seconds or so, and then try and do the next layer. It gives you more time, because the amount of time that it takes to dry is also how quickly or slowly you can fill in shapes. So it's easier to paint when it's humid to fill in shapes, but harder to wait for each shape to dry. So this step totally isn't necessary, but if you want to nerd out like me, I got this little humidity reader off of Amazon for like $5 or $7, and it's a really cool little tool to know how humid it is in the room. I personally prefer to have the humidity about 45 to 50%. That's just a personal preference, because I feel like it gives me the longest amount of time to lay down each shape, but not so long that I'm sitting there all day waiting for it to dry. But because it's really humid in here, it's definitely going to take longer. So another thing to keep in mind when it's really humid is that your paint will want to spread out a bit more on the paper, because the paper itself has a bit more moisture in it. So a good way to get around this is to just thicken your paint a teeny bit, so don't add quite as much water. I think it's a good idea to just sort of experiment with this, paint some little swatches on a rough piece of paper, just to get a feel about how much water you should be adding based on how humid the day is. So now I'll show you some tips for how to fill in shapes. The first thing is, it's your temptation whenever you have a square to outline it. But you don't want to do this with any water-based medium, because one side will start to dry before the other and you'll get an outline around the entire shape, which you don't want. So what you need to do with all shapes is pick one side and move to the other side. I always start on the left because I'm right-handed, and that way I'm not sticking my hand in my paint. So just pick a corner and move from that corner outwards. You can do little bars like this, the top and bottom, but don't go too far into the shape. And that way when you pick up more paint, you can add in where you were last. Move from one side to the other. Like that. So the same thing is true even if you're not painting a square. If you're painting a weird shape, you still have to pick a side and then move from that side to the other. And you kind of have to choose where to start and keep going with it, trying to keep as few areas like this open by themselves. You want to basically keep your edge that's moving towards the other side wet. You don't want it to dry, because if it dries, then you get those hot spots I told you about. You need to have the whole area you're working with be wet. That makes the whole shape stay uniform when you're done. This may feel counterintuitive because of the way you're taught in elementary school to outline a shape before you fill it in. But if you can break that habit, you'll have much cleaner shapes in the end. On the opposite side, when you want to paint around a shape, you have to choose which direction to go, and you want to keep both sides as wet as possible as you do it. So here's a good way to do that. You start in a corner like before, and try and move each side back and forth. So you move this side a bit, then you go back over, and you move the other side a bit. Then you go back over here and move here a bit. If you kind of hop between the two sides, it keeps that edge wet, which is what you need. It's kind of like you pull the paint across the paper from one side of the shape to the other. To recap, the 3 things you have to think about are paint, water, and time. You might have noticed I have to paint pretty quickly. That's to keep that edge, as I was talking about, wet as you move. You don't want that side to dry. So you have to paint each shape pretty quickly, which is the reason that when you're first starting, you probably want to have fairly medium-sized shapes. It makes it easiest to paint if they're not too small or too big. For this last tip, I'll show you the benefits of layering paint versus painting shapes next to each other. I created these 2 blocks of color beforehand and let them dry to show you what I mean about layering paint. So if I put a rectangle here next to this other rectangle, if you don't get those shapes right perfect next to each other, you might start to notice that there's this dark line appearing in between the 2 shapes. This area is brown, blue, but there's this sort of greenish brownish color that's appearing in between. That's because watercolor and gouache are transparent mediums, meaning that they are very liquidy and thin, so you can see the layers of other paint underneath. So I decided to try and use this property of watercolor and gouache to my benefit. So instead of doing that, where I get that line, I instead paint on top. And if you do this, the entire rectangle is the color of that line. But it means that you don't have a line between the shapes at all. It means you get nice, clean shapes for all of your colors. I developed this process a little bit out of necessity because I naturally have very unsteady hands, so I couldn't trust myself to paint two shapes next to each other without getting that line in between. So this was my workaround for dealing with the problem. One thing to keep in mind with this layering process is that it changes the color a little bit. So if you look at this brown is a lot more vibrant and bright than this brown because it's been layered on top of the blue, so you see a little bit of the blue underneath. This means that you have to think a little bit about how to work with complementary colors. Let's take a look at how blue interacts with a complementary color like yellow. First, let's add yellow right next to the blue. And then to compare, let's paint the yellow on top. And as you can immediately see, this yellow is not the bright yellow that is. It's a much fainter yellow that has a little bit of a blue-green tinge to it. So if you want to paint a really bright color, you have to paint those ones separately. Because of how the colors interact and change as you layer them, it can be helpful to test them out.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe to stay up to date on all of our latest videos.